Welcome to the latest episode of the MFG Radio Network's Manufacturing Matters, where industry experts take deep dives into the latest technologies you need to consider to keep manufacturing moving.
Hello, and welcome to Aerospace Industry 2023 Outlook Fall, presented by Richard Aboulafia, brought to you by Aerospace Manufacturing and Design magazine. I'm Eric Brothers, editor for the magazine and the webinar moderator. Aviation industry expert Richard Aboulafia will examine current aerospace markets and what to expect as aerospace firms report their third quarter results. Of particular focus, have the aerospace original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, kept up with their production rate plans? What adjustments are the OEMs making as we head into 2024? How has the economy affected forecasts for this year and next? Our presenter, Richard Aboulafia, fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, is Managing Director, Aerodynamic Advisory of Ann Arbor, Michigan. As many of you know already, Mr. Aboulafia is a widely respected aviation industry expert and contributor to Aerospace Manufacturing and Design's annual forecast issue. He manages consulting projects in the commercial and military aircraft field and analyzes broader defense and aerospace trends. He's advised numerous aerospace companies, including most prime and many second and third tier contractors in the US, Europe, and Asia. He also advises numerous financial institutions on aerospace market conditions. Frequently cited as an aviation industry authority by trade and news publications, Richard has appeared on numerous television, news, and radio programs, including ABC, BBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, CBS, CNN, NBC, NPR, and PBS. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our series sponsors. ISCAR is the largest of the 15 companies comprising IMC, International Metalworking Companies, and has been a leader for nearly 70 years in the development of a dynamic and comprehensive line of innovative precision carbide metalworking tools. They have developed industry-specific solutions to optimize productivity. They understand the unique requirements of each industry and continually improve and introduce new ideas for machining intelligently. Renishaw is a global leader in developing technology that supports manufacturing process control. Renishaw offers an advanced range of calibration, measurement, positioning, and inspection solutions. Specified by leading OEMs around the world, Renishaw encoders, calibration, and measurement systems enable superior process control down to nanometer and picometer levels. We'd also like to thank Fastems as a leading manufacturer of automation equipment and management and production control software for flexible manufacturing systems and cells. The company's solutions for aerospace and other precision industries span from robotics to comprehensive systems that can include secondary operations such as deburring and measuring. Akino is the industry leader in machinery design and digital innovation. Akino produces the world's most accurate and highest quality metal cutting and EDM machines. Their promise of performance is rooted in old school pride and relentless craftsmanship in everything they do. Nigata Engineering, founded in 1895, is the oldest existing horizontal-focused machine tool builder in Japan. Known for their significant performance advancements, Nigata's high-rigidity boxway 5-axis trunnion series solutions for complex aerospace and defense applications are equipped with a one-piece casting trunnion table. Both ends of the table are supported by robust roller bearings and worm wheel drives. This mechanical structure emphasizes stable machining accuracy throughout the work envelope. High horsepower and torque allow you to take full advantage of the rigid machine frame. For hard metals, high torque, heavy-duty spindles are available with up to 1,438 foot-pounds of torque. SMW Autoblock is a global leader of the highest quality work-holding clamping and tooling solutions. Its world-class products guarantee superior precision and repeatability along with dedicated service and support. The organization strives to achieve a deeper understanding of customers' needs to provide products and services geared towards specific customer applications, maintaining long-term, mutually beneficial partnerships to enhance machine tools and drive modern manufacturing. Solar Atmospheres provides commercial vacuum heat treating and brazing services in markets including aerospace and defense. With more than 60 vacuum furnaces from lab size to 48 feet long with 150,000-pound capacity, Solar Atmospheres can handle any size job. It operates plants in eastern and western Pennsylvania, California, and South Carolina, all ISO 9001, 2015, AS 9100D, and NADCAP registered for heat treating. Tata Technologies, a leader in product engineering services, caters to the global manufacturing industry. enabling ambitious manufacturing companies to design and build better products. This includes supplying PLM, CAD, CAM, manufacturing operation management, MOM, and manufacturing execution system, MES, products to the industry. Tata Technologies takes on the challenges of tomorrow by providing cutting-edge solutions to engineer a better world. They help the world drive, fly, build, and farm by enabling their customers to produce better products. Air travel demand domestically this past summer began to exceed pre-pandemic levels. International flights were also booked, judging by some airlines putting their dormant A380s back in service. Aerospace original equipment manufacturers are still sticking to planned production rates, but can they ramp up? Defense aerospace markets are benefiting from war in Eastern Europe, attacks in the Middle East, and confrontations in the South China Sea. Inflation is still with us. Fuel prices have risen recently, as have interest rates, and many financial experts are predicting a mild recession for the first part of 2024. So we asked Richard once again to explain what our members of the aerospace supply chain need to know to prepare for what's ahead. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thanks to Aerospace Manufacturing and Design Magazine, and of course our sponsors for hosting this presentation. It's my privilege to be addressing you again. This is a very weird market environment because, to be blunt, the market environment doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot. This is the first time in my 35 years of tracking the market where it's really just a question of what we can build rather than what the market wants. More on that in a moment. So to all of you who make and support machine tools out there, thank you, and please keep going, because as you'll see, the demand is definitely there. We're just trying to build the darn things. Next page, please. Okay, here's a friendly character just in time for Halloween, which my kids are looking forward to next week. There's this Greek dude, got a job killing monsters, and the only drawback to this job was that if he chopped one head off, another one grew back. So it was kind of one of those make work things. It just never ended. And it sort of feels like the world today, right? It's what we call a polycrisis, a series of interlinked, reinforcing, horrible events that just won't stop. I mean, from the pandemic to Ukraine, and now the horrible Hamas attacks on Israel and whatever else, coupled with various macroeconomic difficulties. It just seems that we've got more cascading crises than any time in my lifetime. And inevitably, well, first of all, I'm going to look at that and just sort of a breakdown on how that's impacting us. But then looking specifically at our industry, how is that polycrisis impacting, for most at least, the aerospace industry segments I cover? And then finally, I'll be providing a production outlook and forecast for your guidance for the coming years. And again, spoiler alert, things are just fine in terms of demand. It's really just a question of what we can build. Next page, please. So people have tried to map what's going on. My mother used to say that if you've got problems, write them down. My mother was incredibly wise, but she wasn't always right. And this is one of those times where it doesn't help at all. But you can see in all of these diagrams of what's going on in the world of geopolitics and macroeconomics were done before the current problems, the current horrors in the Middle East. So it just gives you a feeling for what we're up against. What I've done, next page, please, is looked at 4 areas of environmental change, macro environment change, that are impacting our industry from the outside. And in this, I'm aided by a terrific piece cited there at the bottom. Mohamed El-Arian of Allianz, I believe, he's a senior economist there, wrote a terrific piece in Foreign Affairs saying, look, these are the 4 big macro trends that are coming out of all of this that's going on. Top left, this is the first time really since the 60s, or maybe even earlier, that the defining condition of our economy, the world economy, is that we're going from inadequate demand. We used to go, up to a couple of years ago, was will demand be strong enough? Richard, you're a market analyst guy. What are you saying? It's now inadequate supply. And that's true on many different levels. It's because of supply chain shortages. That's because of labor cost increases. It's because of inflation. It's because of the return of industrial policy. A lot of people want their own industry and they're willing to fund it, not just in aerospace and defense, but in everything. Industrial policy is back. So we're going from a period where, we were worried about how much people would be able to absorb to a period of how much people will be able to build. That's going to last for some time. Second, to the right, a big macro trend. You follow this in the headlines every day, and each day it just gets worse. But China is going dark on us, and that's not just for the outside world. That's also for their own people. They're going from a global trade partner and someone who, maybe didn't always obey the rules, and then began to emerge as a strategic competitor or frenemy. And now they're just going dark. I'd urge everyone to read New Yorker this week has a terrific piece about the big changes in China on the inside. It's a fantastic read. I'd recommend it. Bottom left, the end of endless liquidity. And obviously that shows up first and foremost in higher interest rates and therefore higher debt servicing costs for a lot of people. But also in this industry, it's got an impact on jetliner finance, an impact, again, on company debt in the industry, particularly in the beleaguered second and third contractor tiers, where you often sell machine tools. The primes are fine. First tier's good and bad. You get down a bit and they've taken a few body blows and it's hard to recover. It's hard for them to get the working capital needed to make the production ramp, to afford the machine tools, if you will, to bring on the labor that they need. It's a real challenge. Another related challenge is that there's been an awful lot of cash provided for speculative new ventures in this industry, and that's drying up. That's actually kind of a double-edged sword. The positive side is that if you have fewer of these speculative new ventures, maybe some resources, particularly people, will be freed up for legacy production companies. That's kind of an upside. And then finally, in general, there's greater financial system fragility. This affects our industry a little less than the rest of the outside world, but excuse me, nevertheless, it does have an impact because, of course, a lot of the jetliner business, the really big iron, more than half of it depends on third-party finance. So anything that complicates that is going to complicate our industry in the long run. Next page, please. Now, China is kind of its own polycrisis. I like to use 4 indicators to illustrate they've got big issues. Foreign direct investment there on the upper left, it's collapsed. It just gets worse and worse. To the right, they're the only major economy in the world now dealing not with inflation, but with deflation. Inflation, we know how to deal with that. Deflation, oh, good luck. And their deflationary environment now is as bad as it was during the pandemic, in the heart of the pandemic. So this clearly indicates an economy that's going through some radical changes. On the left, you can see some of that. Investment accounts are trending down. The only thing that's trending up is basically people putting money under a mattress, opening new bank accounts effectively. And that indicates a real loss of consumer confidence as people flee, basically more risky investments or perhaps more flamboyant consumer goods. Like, for example, business jets. That was once a really big market in China. And now that market has effectively collapsed. People are, again, just finding it safer to put their cash under a mattress or something like that. And then finally, look at the air travel recovery in China. The domestic market, you can see that in the dark blue, it's back to pre-pandemic levels. People are going around the country, visiting family and friends, whatever else. But international, it's about 45% of where it was. This is an increasingly insular country, and that's a problem moving forward, because ultimately we want them to be more integrated into the global supply chain and, of course, remain markets for Western jets. Next page, please. And now let's look at how this polycrisis, this series of interlinked troubles, is impacting our industry, starting with the area where it's most impacted. Next page, please. And it's China. no surprise there. You look at China as a growth engine for the jetliner market. It's really pretty extraordinary. They went from 2% of the jetliner market in the year 2000. Insignificant, really. Matter of fact, my first trip to China when I was in my 20s back, it was 1991. And the most common jet in 1991 when I was there, and I flew in one, was a Russian Tupolev 154. I don't recommend it. I don't think, thankfully, there's any left out there. But if you ever given the opportunity to fly in a Tupolev 154, don't. Anyway, between 2000 and 2018, they grew to be the biggest single market in the world, 23% in the year 2018. Since then, things have collapsed. And one common question I get by clients is, can India be the new China? Because, of course, India is growing, it's very dynamic. They haven't turned their backs on the world. And, it's a completely different story. The answer is, in the long run, sure. You can see Indian numbers there in the light blue, but they're starting from a low base. They've got infrastructure challenges. They'll get there. But for the next few years, they're not going to replace what China was to us. Thankfully, demand all over the rest of the world is still pretty darn robust, so we don't have to worry. But in the long run, we should worry. Next page, please. And here's the rest of the world. The good news is on the left, we're pretty much almost back to pre-pandemic numbers in terms of revenue passenger kilometers, air travel demand. We're about 95%, 96%. It's really just Northeast Asia, China. That's the last holdout. Everybody else is at 100, 105%, something like that. As Eric said before, people are even bringing back A380s, one of the world's worst aircraft ever built. That tells you a lot about how strong demand is. Now, but the bad news, relative to where we would have been if that whole atrocity hadn't happened, we've got a 17% impairment when we come out of this, when we fully come out of that. That's our best projection. So it's going to take a while to catch up. You can see the terrible downturn we endured in 2020, 2021. 2020 year-over-year numbers in aggregate were 66% down. We'd never seen anything like that, ever. Now, another challenge, if you look on the right, Airbus, Boeing, and my company, Aerodynamic, we all agree long-term expectations are coming down a bit. We used to, talk in forecasting conferences whether long-term growth would be 5% or 5.1% or 4.9%. I kind of miss those days. Now everyone seems to agree it's in the threes. That's for a combination of reasons. Big part of it is China. A big part of it is maturing economies. Part of it is concerns about the cost of carbon, starting in Europe and wherever else, but broader environmental concerns and whatever else. We'll believe it when we see it, but there is a concern by quite a few people that it's going to be factored in by young people when they make travel plans. I don't know, but it's something that forecasters increasingly point to as an area of concern for long-term travel growth. Next page, please. Another big change. I was kind of a child of the Cold War. I expect some of you were too. And since the Cold War, defense spending had just kept trending down. And then look at that, starting sort of the rise of China as a peer competitor and threat, 2018, 2019. This defense spending increase has gone into overdrive. And this is just the addressable markets. If you look at China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever, we're way beyond 2 trillion at this point and heading north of there, probably to 3 trillion. A lot of people ask, why isn't this higher? And the answer is simple. People can't spend the money fast enough. A big part of that is just the industrial bottlenecks associated with ramping up. We have this defense industrial base that was sized for a much smaller market, and you can't recreate what we had in the Cold War overnight. And it was recently in Tucson, Arizona, which used to be this quiet town where your grandmother went for swap meets or to play cribbage or something. And now there's cranes everywhere because it's a world center of missiles production. Everyone is bulking up. I suspect if this could grow at a faster clip, it probably would. I think the rates of growth would probably be double what you're seeing here. but there are constraints, industrial constraints, and also, frankly, just spending constraints. Economies trying to allocate cash have to go through the usual channels. You're seeing this in a lot of Europe right now and Asia. But anyway, numbers are very strong. It's going to be a long time before we have to worry about any kind of defense downturn. You just look at, well, again, Russia, Middle East, and of course, China, and you can see three very, very different drivers of demand emerging. Next page, please. And it's also interesting, if you look at defense exports, the US is kind of reasserting itself as the nation that matters. If you listen to President Biden's speech the other night, the indispensable country, showing up in the numbers. Good God. If you look at defense exports, purple, US, it is going through the roof. And, France is sort of everybody's second choice, but it's really just a tiny fraction because their industrial output in France is lagging. I've got a couple of emerging producers on the left chart, Turkey, South Korea, Brazil. They're just not ramping up. South Korea, there's promise. They're starting to increase output, but really look at the US. And also look to the right. I've got it on the same scale here, but Russia is collapsing. That's going to stay collapsed. And there are so many reasons for that: political reasons, regulatory reasons, advertising reasons. Russian systems, frankly, don't look very good right now. And then, of course, most of all, you've got industrial bottlenecks because, whoops, it turns out they're completely dependent upon the West for semiconductors and whatever else. So that Russian line is collapsing. 2023, I expect, will be half of what it is here when we get the numbers. It might be a very long time before they recover. A lot of people say China is filling the gap. There's some growth there, but look at the China numbers. It just isn't doing what Russia used to do back, say, in 2018. It's just a tiny fraction. And part of that is because they've got their own industrial bottlenecks. And because, frankly, when you buy an exported weapon system, you're looking for a strategic relationship. You're looking for a partner. And the PRC looks like a really awful partner. Like, they're kind of the neighborhood bully. With the US, you get reasonably nice people, nice military folks who come over and talk about an alliance, maybe, or, hey, if you get into trouble, maybe there'll be an aircraft carrier waiting for you to help. China, they just say, we want your fishing rights. It's just not the same export appeal, period. Next page, please. Now, as Eric mentioned before, one key issue is production. And this is another area where the poly crisis is really impacting. All you have to do is look at the forecast for last year put out by Airbus, Boeing, and Embraer, and then the actuals that came out. And, sure enough, both Airbus and Boeing delivered about 100 fewer jets each than expected. And this guidance change happened relatively late in the year, like, whoops, sorry. And you're seeing this now in real time, even as we speak. Boeing just announced this morning their financial results that they wouldn't be delivering 400 to 450 737s. They'll be doing 375 to 400. Okay, it's late October here. Like, I would think that guidance could have been provided earlier. Maybe we all should have known. Expect to be disappointed by everybody because of all kinds of supply chain difficulties. And also, frankly, because we've had performance difficulties with new generation equipment, particularly engines on the manufacturing front. You've probably been watching the trouble associated with Pratt & Whitney's geared turbofan from Raytheon. Turned out they had a bunch of powdered metal that might have been contaminated. They need to rework that. You might have been following what's happening at Spirit Aerosystems in Wichita with the aft fuselage, improperly drilled holes. Unfortunately, this is becoming all too common in the industry, and rework just complicates all of this. So expect to be disappointed and expect everything to consistently be, pick a number, 15% maybe lighter than expected, than guided, even at this late stage in the year, the sad reality. And that's going to keep going. Next page, please. Now, one thing that's not changing too much, just a little, like I said, I'm exploring the impact of this poly crisis from most to least. This isn't so bad. What you want with jetliners is a really big gap between the cost of money, your financing cost, and the cost of fuel. Now, as you can see on that bottom line, interest rates are coming up. They're now at 5.25 federal fund effective. They're holding there, but if inflation starts galloping up again, we don't really, obviously, we can't predict what's happening with inflation. It's come down a bunch, but now kind of moving sideways. We don't know what the Fed's going to do. We don't want it to go north at 5.25. We just don't. Meanwhile, fuel, obviously driven in part by Middle East affairs. Will it be 80? Will it be 90? Will it be 100 at the end of the year? Will it be 150? Who knows? In an ideal world, it would be between 50 and 85, because cheaper than that, those old jets look pretty good. More than that, you got a hard time flying people and making money with that if you're an airline. So the bottom line is, poly crisis has impacted these indicators, not disastrously. We're okay, but you got to watch these indicators very closely and make sure that we don't move too far out of bounds, either in terms of expensive money or expensive or cheap fuel. Next page, please. Good news. One thing that hasn't changed is people were ordering lots of jets. You saw this catastrophic drop during the worst year of the pandemic. It was the first time in the history of the business that you couldn't measure the book-to-bill ratio, which of course is merely the ratio of orders to deliveries, because orders turned sharply negative. People canceled. They've come roaring back. 2023, it looks like we're going to have a book-to-bill of maybe 1.4 to 1, 1.5. Not bad at all. I'm happy about that. It's a bullish market, even with China largely staying out of this market, China having major issues. The rest of the world is doing just fine. Next page, please. However, there is a secular shift in fleet planning because of the increased capabilities of single-aisle jets, 737 MAX and A320neo families. More and more people are looking to narrow bodies. Meanwhile, we had a lot of oversupply of wide bodies back during the last decade. And on top of that, you've got, basically this international market being the last to recover. So it was impacted most by the pandemic. So as a consequence, what used to be kind of a 50-50 market, looking at backlog and deliveries, is now becoming a 70-30 market in favor of single aisles. And this is a shift in industrial production that's further taxing production resources. Let's say you built machine tools for factories that, delivered A330s or 777s. Those are going to be underutilized. However, if you build machine tools for factories that deliver narrow bodies, you can't build those machine tools fast enough. That demand just keeps going. More on that in a moment. Next page, please. So that's the impact on the market from the poly crisis. I'd now like to walk you through our expectations for the next year or two or 10, depending upon the chart. And again, things are looking surprisingly good, given the chamber of horrors that seems to be impacting our daily newspaper headlines. Next page, please. First of all, jetliners, like I said, there's this weird bifurcation that we've never seen before between single aisles and twin aisles, wide body. There at the bottom, you've got regionals, which are always going to be kind of a depressed market. Nothing ever happens in regionals. Twin aisles, you can see in that green line, there's a recovery underway, but it's sluggish and it's not getting back to the peak this decade, that's for sure. Heavily dominated by the 787 and A350. Everything else, very, very sluggish. And then single aisles, oh boy, we just can't build them fast enough, and that line is coming roaring back. The only thing that's going to mute that growth, probably by, in about 7 or 8 years, is the expectation of some kind of new products emerging sometime in the next decade. This is theoretical. That's why we've got things kind of plateauing there, starting around 2029. But, if both sides decide to say, well, we're happy with what we've got. We don't see any innovative new technologies coming down the pike. And God knows this industry is death on new entrants, really hard for new entrants. It could be that, we actually see just the same level of growth moving beyond the late 2020s. Next page, please. Now, as I mentioned, there's this secular shift in fleet planning. I can't emphasize this strongly enough. If you look at the competitive dynamics between Airbus and Boeing, they're all about equal, looking at their backlogs, except Airbus has a product called the A321neo. It is the single most production-constrained jetliner. Everyone wants one. You see that inset chart. These are A321neo orders by year. Every year or 6 months that Boeing says, we don't need a new jet in this class, we don't see this market as being a major differentiator, you get more airlines saying, oh God, now we have to get in the back of the line and order an A321neo. Thanks, Boeing. What we really need, frankly, is a change of mind at Boeing. In an ideal world, frankly, we get new leadership at the top that recognize the challenge, not just for Boeing, but for a lot of their industrial ecosystem. Basically, they need a new jet in the A321neo class. Until they launch them, well, it's just a question of how many Airbus can build. And frankly, how much Airbus can increase the price without having to worry about anybody leaving, because everyone wants a jet in that class. Next page, please. And ultimately, that's going to be a major driver of fortunes between Airbus and Boeing. Our market share chart breaks out the A321neo there in a kind of lime green. You add that to the light blue rest of Airbus, and by the next decade, what was a 50-50 story becomes more like a 65 or 70-30 story. In effect, Airbus wins unless Boeing changes. Now, it could be that Boeing is simply happy to become a profitable 30% company. The real challenge there, the real problem is, will their core engineering capabilities survive? Will they be able to launch a new product in a couple of years? Because, it's been 18 years since they've launched a clean sheet design. And if you don't use your engineering core, that's going to be a major challenge when the time comes to introduce a new product. If it's another 7 or 8 years, you're looking at a quarter century, that's going to be a major thing to recover from. Next page, please. Turning to the business aircraft market, we just had the National Business Aircraft Association in Vegas last week. It was a fun show, a lot of optimism there. However, the optimism is showing up in higher prices. It's showing up in a greater level of security for the market. But in terms of production, people are being pretty conservative. Part is because they have to be conservative. You've got the same supply chain challenges with business aircraft that you do with jetliners. So neither the big iron at the top, your Gulfstreams, your Dassaults, your Bombardiers, that's growing a bit, but it's not taking off. It's just gently growing. And the bottom half, people are being super conservative. And again, because they have to for production constraints. What is interesting is that bifurcation you saw between the top half and the bottom half, the small and medium on the bottom, the big cabin at the top, that hasn't been repaired. And as a consequence, when you do get orders for machine tools, frankly, it's much more likely to be for something that's really big from Gulfstream or Dassault or Bombardier, where people have the confidence in that top end market to launch all new programs. Next page, please. Now, the combat aircraft market, this is sort of the center of our problem in terms of industrial output. And, obviously you can see the landscape increasingly dominated by the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Look at that dip that we are experiencing. It's hard to identify it because part of it is numbers from the bottom moving up. But if you look at just that red slice this year, it's shrinking. If you could flip a switch, you'd see production output grow to 250 to 300 F-35s per year, because that's what the market wants. As we like to joke, Vladimir Putin is the single best F-35 salesman of all time. The problem is that getting beyond 156 per year is a major industrial challenge. And this year, the reason for that shrinkage is because they're trying to upgrade to what we call the TR3 Block 4 level of capability, and that has had serious delays. And as a consequence, there are a lot of aircraft that are being built but can't be delivered till that software is installed, till those ancillary systems are installed. So you're looking at a major production issue there. They'll overcome it, but boy, there's an awful lot of people who are eagerly waiting for their F-35s that won't be able to get them for a couple of years because of this production bottleneck. We see ultimately by the end of the decade numbers getting to the 170, 180 zone, but that's going to take big investments by everybody. New programs there at the top, T-7, and more importantly, B-21, the new stealth bomber coming out of Palmdale, California. That's California's first jet built since the last C-17 was delivered out of Long Beach about 5 years ago. Welcome news indeed. Program seems to be going really well. Bit of happy news in the world of difficult programs. Next page, please. Europe, you saw obviously a bit of a dip there, and then Ukraine happened and things came back. A lot depends on new programs, particularly Tempest F3, but also in Germany and France. But those won't see metal cut till the next decade. So till then, it's a somewhat muted market environment. Next page, please. Now, what we're expecting the next couple of years, solid growth for all segments. Single aisle jets and twin aisle jets lead the pack. You've got, in aggregate, total industry output growing at 16% this year and 15%. Now, the bad news is some of those jetliners are already built. So if you subtracted those, you'd actually see something in the 12% range. The good news is if you could respond to actual market needs and wants, you'd see 20 to 25% growth. What you've got here is a production constrained number. I wish we were delivering to the tune of 23, 24, 25% greater numbers. We can't, we just can't. Whether it's labor, whether it's castings and forgings, whether it's ball bearings, whether it's interiors, whether it's software, we just have too many production constraints to get to the kind of fantastic growth numbers that I would like to see for a recovery. Next page, please. That's it. That's my final chart. I will turn back over to Eric for questions, and I'm happy to discuss any aspect of this industry that you'd like.
Thank you, Richard. As usual, a very comprehensive view of the markets. Let's take some questions now. I have one to start with. So is this a time of multi or poly crises? Is this going to be the new norm, or have we faced these multiple challenges simultaneously before?
Yeah, great question. It's obviously to a certain extent above my pay grade, but you talk to smart people out there in the world of economics and politics. I do a bit of work with Eurasia Group, and their view is this has happened before, but we are undergoing an unusually chaotic period. They compare it to other moments in time. World War I comes to mind, unfortunately, 1914. 1848 in Europe of all times comes to mind. To a much lesser extent, the late 60s comes to mind. Will that be the new normal? What is changing relative to those is simply the sheer number of people on the planet and the greater level of resource scarcity. So a lot of, people scrambling for resources and power in a relatively constrained globe. So talking to smart people out there, I think, unfortunately, I'd have to say my answer is, yeah, there's a certain new normal going on here.
All right. Well, regarding India, we have a question. Does the population density have a negative impact on the economic growth potential there?
It doesn't until it does, right? I mean, you look at I guess India is now the most populous country. It's still growing at a pretty good clip. At what point do you have, I don't know, something to do with global climate change or whatever else impacting growth. It hasn't shown up yet. It might not. I don't know. There are an awful lot of smart people saying, yes, it will. I'm inclined to listen to experts, but who really knows? We just don't know.
All right. Another question. Do you get a sense that the airframe and engine OEMs are really prioritizing improving their external supply chains, or are they using those issues to control their own internal production rates, capital expenditure requirements, pricing, and customer performance penalties?
Yeah, great question. Really interesting. And God knows in the business jet world, that might be the case, right? No better way to firm up pricing than to create a level of scarcity. However, the thing that complicates that answer is on the defense side, these are cost plus contracts. You deliver, you get money, you get profits, and they can't deliver. That to me says the problem is coming from outside the house. If you're delivering missiles or artillery shells or combat aircraft, people are throwing money at you. I'm not so sure they're arguing over price. So I don't think any level of resource scarcity or output scarcity changes anything. So I think therefore, the answer to my question is that it's probably more outside, but there are probably some segments like business aircraft where it's probably on the inside. And you certainly heard talk of that at NBAA last week. There's no better way to keep pricing up than to keep output muted.
Right. All right. You mentioned the downturn of wide bodies, but Airbus seems quite bullish ramping up their A330 and A350 programs. Do you think they're overly optimistic with their rate expectations?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I remember where they're coming from. It's a downturn, but we're coming out of that now. We are growing. I believe their expectation is to get to 9 per month on the 350, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 per month or 3.5 per month on the 330. The 330 actually peaked out at one point at 12 per month. So you're kind of a shadow of that. And as for the 350, been there, done that. They'd already gotten, I believe, to 9 or 10 per month back during the good days. So those are two programs that are doing okay. The 350 is doing really pretty well. The 330, it's a fraction of what it was. So we got to keep these things in relative terms, relative to where we were in the 20 teens or whatever we call that decade. We're just not planning to be anything like that level. Relative to what we've just come out of in 2020, 2021, yeah, it's absolutely good to see numbers coming back with those programs.
All right. Airbus's A321neo is powered by the geared turbofan. Is that affecting demand and deliveries due to the current issues with that engine?
Well, it's the market for that. They offer you a choice of engines, actually. You can get 1As from GE, Safran, CFM, or you can get the geared turbofan. And then there's a bunch of folks who haven't determined which engine because, they've got 3 or 4 years to play with, so they haven't made a final determination. So far, there's been no major shift in market share. Having said that, the LEAP 1 was a little bit ahead. I don't think you're going to see many people cancel their GTF and go to the LEAP 1 because the LEAP 1 folks are just as production constrained as everybody else. So if you cancel your 321neo with a GTF that's due for delivery, say in 2 years, you probably have to go to the back of the line for the other guy's engine. And you also have the complication of a heterogeneous fleet, which from a training logistics standpoint, just makes your life difficult. So the answer is, in terms of market share, not so much. In terms of production constraints, absolutely right. Definitely. You're going to see 321 numbers disappoint for the next year or two because of GTF production constraints and rework issues.
All right. Another participant asks if you would please elaborate on the TR3 Block 4 software bottleneck is with the F-35 and why that is holding up production.
Yeah, they're building the planes, but Block 4, as I understand it, is mostly software driven. I think a lot of it has to do with weapons targeting and weapons carriage and things like that. Unfortunately, I believe it requires a considerably greater level of thermal management for all the power going into these systems. I'm getting out of my depth here to a certain extent because I haven't gone into the engineering parts of it, but my understanding is a lot of it comes down to cooling and software and things like that. So the systems that haven't been installed yet are related to those things. The general feeling is that things will be sorted out somewhere between first and second quarter next year. And at that point, they'll be able to catch up. In other words, it's not like they're doing a major external design change. They're not putting on a new wing or anything like that. A lot of it is, like I said, software or fairly discrete systems that simply need a greater level of cooling or what have you. So I'm hoping that that guidance is accurate and that we're back on track by midpoint next year. But right now, it sure is creating a bit of a production snafu.
All right. We spoke about this earlier in the year, but is it still a problem? What issues are you seeing with castings and forging deliveries?
Yeah, it's the good news is I think it's a little less of a bottleneck. The bad news is it's still a challenge because obviously an awful lot of, especially titanium and also nickel castings and forgings came from some dangerous neighborhoods, particularly Russia. And, right now we're able to get by. The Japanese are ramping up very nicely. US companies are ramping up very nicely. So the potential for trouble is very much there. But right now we're meeting demand more or less. I don't think it's quite the bottleneck it was or had been. Unfortunately, other bottlenecks have emerged. You're hearing everything from coatings to ball bearings. So it's kind of a mixed story, I guess I would say.
All right. You talked a little bit about the regional airliners. Where do you see the Airbus A220 in about 5 years? Will it cut into its own A320 sales or would it have a greater impact on Embraer?
Yeah, we spent a lot of this year's Paris Air Show back in June looking at the question of whether or not they would launch the Dash 500 version of the A220. And if they did, what would it look like? Because you could go with a completely different engine, maybe even a different wing, and get something that really cuts into the heart of the 320neo. The problem, of course, is that if you're Airbus, that it derails your production ramp on the 320neo for the long run. More importantly, it dilutes your profit margins because the 320neo is very profitable, whereas the A220, especially if you completely redo it, is just not profitable. So I tend to be pretty conservative. I don't think you're going to see a major redo of the aircraft. You might see a new engine. You just might. They're talking to customers. They've been talking to customers. Our expectation is that there's a Dash 500 by the end of the decade, and it does indeed take away a chunk of 320neo demand moving forward. But there are big departure scenarios. One is a more elaborate Dash 500. The other is a less ambitious, just a simple stretch. And that seems to be what some customers want, just basically something that 2,200 nautical miles, they don't need more than that, holds 150 people, gets the job done with really good economics. Either way, another complication is that Airbus has an opportunity to go after Boeing's core market. If you saw that backlog chart I showed earlier, really the one place that Boeing is strong, the one lever it can keep pulling to bring in cash is the 737 MAX 8. And if Airbus does the A220-500 right, then in a few years it could really hit to the heart of what Boeing does. And the sort of nightmare scenario for Boeing is that Airbus starts talking with Southwest, which of course has been the launch customer exclusive 737 carrier for umpteen generations of 737. So if they break with Boeing and start looking at an A220 family order, that would be what we call a bit of a heart attack moment. So there are all these complications. But again, getting back to our baseline scenario, you do see it impinging upon 320neo demand by the end of the decade in its new, bigger, but not completely redone incarnation.
All right. What's your opinion about Lockheed leaving the aerial refueling competition for the KC-46 and Airbus's intentions to go it alone?
Yeah, it's problematic. I mean, the economics were always bad. I mean, because you've got the KC-46, the line's running hot, it's got its problems, but the losses are absorbed by Boeing, not the taxpayer, because it's a fixed price contract. So basically, Airbus and Lockheed Martin had to match that, because it's a price shootout, with a bigger plane. Oh, and by the way, pay for industrialization in Georgia. And on top of that, provide profits for two different companies. That was never going to work. So when the Air Force said, actually, we want to order a much smaller number of KC-Ys anyway, that wrecked it for Lockheed. They was like, yeah, sorry, we're just going to focus on KC-Z, adding some value. And obviously they can't add value because they've got Skunk Works, great prototype facility. They can say, hey, KC-Z is going to be a radical new airframe optimized for coping with the Western Pacific threat, optimized for dealing with the Chinese threat environment. And as for Airbus, that leaves them in a very difficult position. They're going to come in with an offer, but they're not going to be able, I don't think, to create a final assembly line for the 330. They might give it a shot, but for 75 planes, that's a lot of work. So you can't rule out that they'll do that, but I doubt it. And if you don't do that, you don't have the kind of political and industrial constituency you needed to sell this plane to Congress. That's going to be a major challenge. So I think the odds are against them. It's a good plane. I wish them all the best, but the odds are against them.
All right. Another question. What do you think is the likelihood that Airbus will build another A320 final assembly line to increase its capacity? Maybe India?
You know, you can't rule that out. You're up to 4 FACOs for the 320 family and a 5th line if you count the 221 and or 6, 5th and 6th, because there's 2 A220 lines. But just looking at the 320 family, my colleague and company founder and co-managing director Kevin Michaels has an interesting thesis that says, rather than looking at a new FACO, they should actually increase the manufacturing footprint at the existing FACOs, particularly in Mobile, Alabama, because that would give them a greater hedge against foreign currency fluctuations. It would give them access to U.S. labor. It would give them a greater political footprint in the U.S., never a bad thing, particularly when going after defense contracts. It's a provocative thesis he's got. Having said that, boy, India does beckon. It really does. I think it's something they'll look at. There's a provision in Boeing's agreement with labor that they reached back a dozen years ago that says they can't do that. The 737 has to be built in Puget Sound. So they don't have that option. Now, having said that, the India market just isn't quite big enough. You saw that chart I had before. It's not the China market at its peak. So will it justify a line? I don't know. It's a really interesting question. And as you can see, it's very complicated.
All right. A lot of economists are predicting a slowdown, at least for the early part of 2024. Is that a short-term or a long-term concern?
You know, I think at this point, the joke has become, forecasters have successfully predicted 15 of the last 3 downturns. Boy, this is the Energizer Bunny of economies. I don't know. I mean, if you raise interest rates, you should have induced a slowdown. That didn't happen. I tend to think that the level of demand relative to supply might just insulate us against any kind of slowdown. And you'll see yet another expectation of a forecasted downturn dashed. Having said that, in terms of structurally, in terms of looking at the history of economic cycles, boy, are we way overdue for a slowdown. That's for sure. But I just don't see any of the fundamentals adding up to it. Now, happily, one thing they all agree upon is it's going to be a, couple quarters at most, a relatively modest catching your breath, or a kind of rejiggering of things in the event that interest rates go up again. But right now, we're just not seeing it.
Right. Are labor strikes a concern?
It's interesting. Yes and no. Another great wobbly economics answer. Spirit Aerosystems, American Airlines, United Airlines, Delta Airlines all have one thing in common. They had labor agreements over the past few months that were all between 38 and 44% over the next 4 years. That is the new price of labor. Have a nice day. Everyone has to pay it, clearly, unless we do have a recession, unless things do soften. It wasn't conceivable to most economists that you could have unemployment in the 3.6% zone for a sustained period of time. That should not be possible, but here we are. And people say, well, maybe they're making that number up. No, because I would love to meet those workers. A lot of people I know could use those workers. If you're not working, please work. We need you in the aerospace industry. All this to say, will there be a disruption if people don't pay that 38 to 44% number? Sure, absolutely. And I understand why people are reluctant to pay a whole lot more. The big development in our industry will be, I think it's in the third quarter next year, but yeah, Boeing machinists are up for a renegotiation. That's going to be the real litmus test here. That's going to be really interesting to watch.
All right. How much should we be concerned that defense needs will pull even more resources from commercial aircraft production, creating further delivery delays? And what are those most critical resources?
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, that question really gets to the heart of what keeps me up at night. People ask you, well, what's the biggest thing that keeps you up at night? That's exactly it. Anything that drags productive resources away from commercial. And how does that happen? An awful lot of defense contracts are cost plus. So if you need to pay 38 to 44% more for labor, for example, biggest single bottleneck of all, no matter what place you are in the supply chain, labor, then your ability to pay those workers is typically a lot better on the defense side relative to commercial. That's a huge area of concern, because even though there are inflationary pass-through provisions on commercial contracts, they kind of get more limited, in terms of how far they could go up or whatever. So all this to say, yeah, this should be really concerning if you believe what I believe, which is that we're in for a very long, sustained period of increased defense spending. That's going to create a drag on the commercial side of things. Absolutely. We saw this in Vietnam. I wasn't around for that, but you look at what happened in 1967, 1968. We're talking, 156 F-35s per year. The max rate of the F-4 Phantom was 72 per month back in 1968. And that had exactly the same impact on commercial jetliner economics. It absolutely clobbered things despite strong demand. So I'm concerned we might see a repeat of that.
All right. You mentioned that Boeing announced that it expects to deliver probably fewer jets than they had originally anticipated. And yet they also announced that they were transitioning to greater production rates on their 787s and also on the 737s from 31 per month to 38. What is allowing them to expand that number? Or is that just their optimism?
I mean, you got to be an optimist in this world, right? I mean, give you an idea. If we do 375 this year in output, that's great. But a lot of those are already built, right? So in terms of new build production, you're really looking at something that's in the 28, 26, 24 per month. They're just announced, or they're several times reinforced announced, objective is to get to 38, I believe later this coming year. Will that happen? Fingers crossed, right? And the ultimate objective is sometime in mid-2025 to get to 57. Again, fingers crossed. Similarly, Airbus wants to get to 75 sometime in the back half of 2025. A320 family jets per month. I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't bet on either of them. It's just an aspiration, and prepare to be disappointed. Hopefully we'll get part of the way there.
Well, we certainly aren't disappointed in your comments. And unfortunately, though, we are out of time. So thank you, Richard, again, for your presentation and responses. Also, thanks to Iskar and Renishaw, Fastums, Makino, Nigata Engineering, SMW Autoblock, Solar Atmospheres, and Tata Technologies. Be sure to register for our upcoming free webinars at the events menu tab of our websites. If you have any comments or suggestions, please email them to me at ebrothers@gie.net. On behalf of Aerospace Manufacturing Design, I wish you a good day and goodbye for now.
You can find more Manufacturing Matters plus the MFG Radio Network's other podcasts on Apple Music, Spotify, Google Podcast, or on our websites,